There is a $100 trillion problem currently unfolding across the European continent. It is not an infrastructure deficit. It is not a banking crisis. And it is not a geopolitical conflict, at least not in the traditional sense. It is the simple, terrifying fact that the workers needed to sustain the world's most advanced welfare states are missing. Imagine a vast, complex machine, humming with the promise of prosperity. A machine so powerful, it powered the global economy for centuries. Now picture one critical component, the century drive belt, slowing down, wearing thin, and threatening to snap. That drive belt is Europe's young, productive workforce, and its absence is creating a labor vacuum that is starting to suck the vitality out of the entire continent. A financial crisis measured not in quarterly earnings, but in decades. This vanishing act is not a coincidence. It is the inevitable consequence of a profound, century-long societal bargain that has finally come due. Welcome back to Mindshift Economy. Today, we are peeling back the layers on Europe's demographic dystonia fate that holds global consequences for every investor, policymaker, and worker on Earth. For the post-war generations, the European dream was built on a simple, yet brilliant, financial equation. Massive economic growth, fueled by a baby boom, underwriting a generous and comprehensive welfare state. This system, which guaranteed strong pensions, public health care, and free education, was essentially a generational contract. The young would work and pay into the system. The old would retire and draw from it. The contract worked perfectly as long as the incoming generation was consistently larger than the outgoing one. But in the 1970s, something fundamental shifted. Suddenly, prosperity, education, and the widespread availability of birth control intersected with changing social values. The average fertility rate across Europe plummeted, falling far below the replacement rate of $2.10 children per woman. The youth bulge vanished, yet the social promises, the generous pensions, the low retirement ages were never adjusted. This created a structural deficit, a growing chasm between the financial obligations governments took on and the shrinking pool of young workers available to pay for them. Now, we are entering the final, inevitable phase where the promises made in the boom years meet the silence of the empty cradles. This crisis is accelerating, driven by three interconnected forces that have turned Europe's greatest strength into its greatest vulnerability. The first accelerating force is the great skill, drained a quiet exodus of the continent, its most valuable asset, its educated, mobile youth. You see, the demographic issue is not just about having fewer young people. It's about losing the best young people. Europe invests heavily in education, producing world-class engineers, scientists, and tech innovators. But once these highly skilled individuals graduate, they look at the economic landscape: stagnant wages, high marginal tax rates, and historically expensive housing, and compare it to the explosive opportunity and often lower tax burdens found in places like the United States, Asia, or the Middle East. They are experiencing what economists call wage compression, where their salaries, after decades of slow growth, simply do not reflect their productivity or global market value. Consider the average mid-career software developer in Berlin versus one in Seattle. The net adjusted income difference can be staggering. Europe essentially subsidizes the education of the world's labor force, training talent only to watch them pack their bags and send their tax revenue elsewhere. This creates a destructive feedback loop. The remaining, shrinking workforce must shoulder an ever greater tax burden to maintain the welfare state, making the prospect of staying even less attractive for the next graduate. It is a slow-motion intellectual bleeding that systematically removes the very engine of innovation and productivity. Europe desperately needs to compensate for its demographic decline. But here's the real twist. The missing workers aren't just the ones who left. Many are still within Europe's borders, but they are trapped. The second force is the internal inertia of labor. Despite the economic crisis, Europe's single market designed to allow the free movement of workers is not functioning effectively to solve the shortage. You can have massive labor demand in Germany for technicians and engineers, and simultaneously, high youth unemployment in parts of southern Europe. Why don't they simply move? The barriers are deep, subtle, and often cultural. They include complex issues, like different languages, non-transferable professional certifications, and a profound lack of affordable housing in the high-demand northern economic hubs. Additionally, the labor market itself is often rigid and overly protective of existing workers, making it difficult for younger, more adaptable individuals to enter, move, and rapidly acquire the specific skills that are actually in demand. Instead of a fluid labor market where workers chase opportunities, Europe has a fragmented patchwork. The economic reality is that the older, established generations, protected by strong labor laws, are inadvertently creating a moat around the job market, slowing down the structural changes and labor mobility necessary to save the system. The demographic crisis is therefore being amplified by a crisis of internal economic friction, where the right worker can't get to the right job, even though both exist within the same economic bloc. Most people don't know what happened next in the financial equation, because the looming problem is debt, but a special kind of debt. The third, and perhaps most dangerous force, is the unfunded mandate cliff. Remember that generational contract we talked about? The massive pension and healthcare liabilities governments promise but have never actually saved for, known as unfunded mandates. For many core European countries, the cost of these future obligations dwarfs the visible national debt we see in the headlines. This is the $100 trillion problem in its purest form. The staggering amount of debt implicitly owed to future retirees. Imagine a family that promises to give their 5 children $1 million each for retirement, but only has one working child to earn that money. The total cost of the debt remains the same, but the burden on the single worker becomes impossible. As the base of young taxpayers shrinks, the interest on the already high national debt becomes harder to service, forcing the government to either issue more debt, compounding the problem, or divert capital from productive investment, like R&D and digital infrastructure, towards simply paying for elderly care and pensions. This stagnation in public investment further cripples future productivity, guaranteeing that the economy will grow slower than the debt it owes. This is a structural poverty trap, where the collective promise of security in the past is actively guaranteeing the economic decline of the future. This is where things take a turn and we ask the critical, politically charged question: what happens when the system hits the wall? The solution, at least in pure economic terms, is terrifyingly simple. Europe needs a massive, sustained, and strategically managed influx of young, skilled, working-age immigrants, not just for low-wage jobs, but for high-tech value positions. The numbers required to offset the demographic trend are vast, potentially millions annually for decades. Economically, this would stabilize the tax base, inject youthful dynamism into the labor market, and slow the advance of the unfunded mandates. However, this is precisely where the economic necessity collides violently with political and social reality. The political backlash against immigration is already one of the defining features of contemporary Europe. The very generation that most benefits from the taxes paid by immigrants, the eldelius, often the most politically resistant to the demographic change required to save their pensions. This creates a profound democratic paradox. A political system where the majority of voters are aging, and they vote to preserve policies that protect their existing benefits, even if those policies structurally guarantee the economic decline that will ultimately bankrupt the system. Europe's demographic clock is not a prediction. It is a certainty. The children who will enter the workforce in 2045 have already been born, and there simply aren't enough of them. The great experiment of the European welfare state, the attempt to blend deep social protection with sophisticated capitalism, is now facing its ultimate reckoning. The continent is entering a period of forced economic and social contraction. For you, the viewer, the implications are clear. The economic engine of Europe will continue to sputter, which means less global demand, slower innovation in key sectors, and increased financial volatility worldwide. The mystery of the missing workers reveals a deeper truth about the global economy. Wealth is not just stored in banks or digital ledgers. It is fundamentally stored in the size, youth, and productivity of a population. Europe's story serves as a profound warning. A society can become so focused on guaranteeing the comfort of the present that it inadvertently sells off the future. The debt will be paid, not with currency, but with a loss of global stature and a quiet, persistent decline in living standards. The $100 trillion question is not how Europe will fix this, but how quickly the rest of the world will learn from its mistake.